Just a few days ago, I had a video about the 5 things that, Think Critical viewers, comic fans were really upset with. One of the things I didn't really cover in depth, I acknowledged it, but we didn't actually talk about it, was the price of comic books going up and up and up. And we're going to have a conversation about the price of comic books and how it's basically gotten out of hand. There are even publishers out there like Distillery. I think the minimum price for a comic book that they produce might be $7. It's absolutely ridiculous because for a lot of these companies, the comic book isn't even to be read. It's a collectible. They don't even treat it like it's a disposable portion of a story anymore because, it's got the covers and all this kind of stuff. And the prices have skyrocketed and absolutely destroyed the pace of inflation, especially since like the 80s. Comic books technically right now, based on the rate of inflation over time, in America at least, should be like right around, I think it was $250. And obviously we're well past $250 and all that kind of stuff. It's got a lot of people pissed off and deservedly so. And in fact, I'm going to give you guys the numbers of the major publishers out there, the 6 major publishers in American comic books. I can't hit all of them because that would be a lot of work, but I do have the numbers as far as how expensive it is to be a Marvel fan, a DC fan, an Image fan, IDW, Boom, and Dark Horse. I believe those are the ones that I have numbers for. But this isn't a new problem. This is something that we've been dealing with and talking about for a very, very long time. And I think people probably wish we could go back to the days where the price increase was 5 cents or a quarter, but now it's always $1 or $1.25. It's absolutely crazy. But this is what sci-fi.com had to say about the prices increasing all the way back in March of 2021. Both DC and Marvel have almost completely eliminated the $2.99 cover price comic. DC has a couple of Scooby-Doo titles at that price, which is a smart move since they target a younger audience. But almost every other comic from the 2 biggest publishers starts at $3.99. In fact, June solicitations for both Marvel and DC show a bunch of books listed at $4.99. And that's too many $4.99 comics for me to buy in for 1 month. It's why I skipped King in Black, despite my interest in the event. There are just too many books to pay at $4.99 and $5.99 price points. So that means I skip the floppies and wait for the trade. And price point is very, very important at this time because inflation is very, very high. Disposable income isn't really out there, and you're making people choose between milk and comic books. And that basically is a choice that's the easiest choice in the world. Am I going to eat or am I going to read a comic book that wasn't even created to be read? It was supposed to only be a collectible. And a lot of people have turned their back on the industry. And what happens when people kind of walk away and your customer base shrinks and shrinks, you got to keep bumping up the price and bumping up the price. And it's really an issue that Marvel and DC have created for themselves. You'll remember the God's #1 debacle, $9.99 for a comic book. That was supposed to be an ongoing. Didn't make it to a year because they fucked up the entire launch of the book by pricing it so sky high that it's not even worth investing at this point. Remember when DC all of a sudden started pricing everything at $4.99? But wait, you got 40 pages because there's a backup story from somebody that you've never even heard of. A lot of those books don't even have the backup story anymore. They're just $4.99, but they're 32 pages now. Anything that's got Absolute on it, anything that's got Ultimate on it are all going to be $4.99. And it's pretty wild how this thing has happened to where even retailers themselves have come to the conclusion that you can't make money in this market because at the prices that they're charging, there just isn't enough interest, everyday interest from normies to come in and buy Marvel and DC comic books. I'm sure you've all heard of Chuck Rosansky, the owner of Mile High Comic Books. There was an article from Phil Boyle, I think it was last year, that got a lot of retailers talking about the prices and a lot of issues that were plaguing comic books at the time. And this is what he had to say in a newsletter. This is from one of the most, if not the most, successful comic book retailer in North America. I have to just shake my head at these cries and lamentations as I tried to warn everyone about 5 years ago that it's going to take some outrageously entertaining storylines to keep fans consistently shelling out $3.99 each or more for new comics. I personally doubted if that was even going to be possible, so I gently suggested, okay, not so gently, that all direct market comic shops needed to immediately diversify into higher margin collectible products. There we go. One of the biggest retailers in all of North America, Chuck Rosansky, whether you love him or hate him, who's certainly been influential, and 5 years ago was already telling people that $3.99 was a barrier to entry. That was a reason for people to walk away. And as a comic book retailer, him being the most successful or amongst the most successful in all of North America, you cannot rely on comic book sales anymore. They've gotten so expensive that you need to start going into Funko Pops. You need to go into action figures. You need to go into T-shirts. You need to go into soda pop. You need to go into popcorn. You need to go into posters. You need to go into tabletop gaming. You need to do anything in the world to keep your comic book shop alive by focusing on something else, because Marvel and DC at that price, and the rest of the industry, we're not going to cut it. And I couldn't agree with them more, because I can tell you, even the books that you're getting still for $3.99, there are no outrageously entertaining storylines for the most part going around outside of maybe like a Transformers, a Conan the Barbarian, Rook Exodus. Most of that stuff is happening on the indie scene, but even then, it's very fucking expensive. You want to read the very first story arc of Rook Exodus, and I certainly suggest all of you do, it comes upwards about $30 because it's 6 issues to get the first story. That is a lot of moolah. That is a lot of money, and it's basically unsustainable. They don't write periodic comic books anymore. They write everything for the trades. It's something that I talked about that if they wanted to save the industry, they were going to have to move away from, but that's clearly not going to happen. And there you have a prominent retailer saying, hey, I lived the dream. I always want to be a part of comic books. I think he owned and ended up auctioning off the most expensive, valuable Action Comics #1 book in the history of the world, right? The one from the, I can't remember the name of the collection, the one that was in Colorado that was basically pristine. He ended up getting his hands on it. I think he auctioned it a few years ago. But he's telling people, now is not the time. Comic books are far too expensive. Of course, Marvel and DC have heard this. In fact, we did have Marvel president Dan Buckley speaking at Comic Pro earlier this year. He actually acknowledged some of the problems and what they were going to do to mitigate those problems and address the retailer concerns about rising price costs. On price, Buckley said the bulk of the line will be $3.99, which drew applause from the audience, although we qualified it by saying number ones, top titles, top talent, top characters will be priced at $4.99. Event books, one-shots, and anniversary issues will also be exceptions to the $3.99 price point, but will have more consistent pricing. So there you go. We're going to hold the line at $3.99 unless it's a character you want to read, a writer that you want to read, an event, a one-shot, a celebration. So we had all these fucking qualifiers in there. So you know what you can get for $3.99? You can get Ghost Spider, Spider-Gwen. You can get New Champions. You know what I mean? All the books that nobody wants to read. There's one book that I know of at Marvel that's $3.99 and it's totally worth it, and it's actually a good book. And I believe it's The Incredible Hulk. I think that one's still $3.99. But you ain't getting Avengers. You're not getting X-Men, Uncanny X-Men, Wolverine, Spider-Man, Captain America, Iron Man. I believe all those books are $4.99 at this point. It's absolutely ludicrous that he got that round of applause and then fucking caged the whole thing saying, oh yeah, it's going to be $3.99 unless it's something people want to buy. And then we're going to gouge the fuck out of you. But there's going to be more consistent pricing. We're going to charge $6.99. And if you look at the December comic book solicitations from Marvel Comics, I believe you will find $5 or $6 from Marvel priced at $6.99, which I think is an outrageous price. And I wouldn't buy any of those books. It's the reason I told everyone to stay away from God's #1, even if it was good. And I'm very lucky that, when I started the channel, I was having to pay for all the books, in digital and all that kind of stuff. And it was pretty expensive back then. I'm very lucky that I actually get review copies at this point from most of the publishers. Otherwise, I don't even know that I could continue the channel at this point. I would be throwing almost as much money into buying the comic books as I actually get back from YouTube at this point. That's how ridiculous a lot of these prices are, because the books that you do want to read that are actually good are all fucking expensive anyway, because Marvel Comics and Dan Buckley never wanted to address the actual issue. They never wanted to make it better. They didn't want to help retailers. They just wanted them to shut the fuck up. Stop complaining. We're going to give you some $3.99 comic books. It just so happens it's going to be whatever book that you don't want to buy and you don't think you can sell. It's going to be Venom War tie-ins that no one gives a flying fuck about. It's going to be Miles Morales that doesn't really sell. It's going to be the She-Hulk book and an array of other characters that, quite frankly, never fucking move the needle and never will. Captain Marvel, probably still $3.99, but might be $4.99. I don't remember. We don't even have a Captain Marvel book at this point. because they have to keep canceling it because nobody orders it. Now, there is one man out there that actually wants to help retailers, wants to do good by the customer. His name is Todd McFarland. This is what Todd McFarland said about pricing his line, for the most part, at $2.99, not $3.99, $2.99. Todd McFarland. I don't think people realize how important pricing is in terms of having a successful book. I'm going to assume that not everyone has a ton of disposable income, so every time they decide to spend their money, it's a choice. I'm hoping to make it easier for people who are curious to see what is going to happen here with some of these new books, and maybe they're lap spawn collectors or something like that, and they want to maybe try and get back in and sample some of these issues. And most of the Spawn line is, in fact, $2.99. I think there is a anthology book out there right now that's like $5.99, but it's like double-sized or whatever. One person in all of comic books tries to make a difference. Now, Mark Millar also tried to do something like this. He did have the first volume of Nightclub at $1.99. Unfortunately, that was probably a little bit too cheap. He probably should have went to $2.99, and that didn't end up working out in his favor. But based on what Todd McFarland is doing, and that is not the only book that they sell for $2.99. I believe Saga might still be $2.99 when it's actually coming out. I think the new Knights versus Samurais book is $2.99, and they have a couple of other books out there that are actually $2.99. Shockingly enough, the cheapest comic book publisher out there is Image Comics. Image Comics has basically taken the place of Vertigo. And Vertigo titles were always more expensive. And actually, indie comic books in general are always more expensive than Marvel and DC because you're paying like a little prestige price for it. And the fact that their orders are going to be a lot smaller than Marvel and DC. Yet somehow, Image, who definitely sell a lot less comic books than Marvel when it comes to volume on a monthly basis, are shockingly cheaper than Marvel. This is how much it costs on average to buy an Image comic book in November of 2024, next month. $4.18 an issue, almost right at that $3.99 line, a little bit over it, obviously. And that's with 55 total comic books. It's not like it's a small number. They're publishing almost the exact same number of titles that DC are in a month, yet they're significantly cheaper than DC and Marvel. What about that number one issue upcharge that everybody seems to give you? You seem to have to pay at least 50 cents extra for a number one issue. Not the case for the most part at Image Comic Books. In November, the average price of their number one issues, $4.17. So actually a penny cheaper than their average issue being put out there. Somehow we've gotten to the place where the prestige comic book publisher, Image, is cheaper than Marvel and DC. Now, Marvel and DC aren't even the most expensive publisher out there. I know this one's going to blow your fucking mind. You will not believe it. It's actually IDW Publishing. The average cost of an IDW comic book in November of 2024 is $5.71. Talk about fucking ridiculous. $5.71. Absolutely insane. The average price of a number one comic book from IDW is $6.40. Now, what could be going on at IDW that would even suggest that people should be even paying prices that are that expensive in comparison to an Image Comics, which puts out far better comic books essentially every single week? Roughly 1 year after a company-wide reset at IDW Publishing, there's more changing in the company structure and even ownership. This comes as the company reports some of its highest pre-orders for a comic in years with Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Revamp, and IDW renewing its non-exclusive licensing deal with Paramount to publish TMNT, Star Trek, and other franchises of comics. All this happens after IDW CEO Davide Jonas has taken over majority control of the company from his father, Howard Jonas, who became majority owner in 2007. In March of 2024, the younger Jonas acquired IDW shares that represent roughly 60% of voting rights for the company, shares that were previously owned directly by Howard Jonas or placed by the elder Jonas in trust for his children. So basically what happened is IDW had to massively overpay for their TMNT license. Now, they're not going to pay for their own mistake. They've got to take it out on the customer. They paid so much for fucking TMNT that they have to charge ridiculous prices, not just on TMNT. They have to charge ridiculous prices on My Little Pony, a comic book brand designed for like little girls. What little girl has $7 for a fucking comic book? On Godzilla comics and shit like that. They overcharge you on everything now because they paid out the ass just to contain or keep the rights to producing TMNT comic books. the only thing that they have left that really sells. Also, because the Jonas family can't be living in poverty, they still have to be rich. You know what I mean? His dad didn't put that money in a trust for no reason. He didn't give me those shares to go and ruin them. We've got to charge extra money, even though our comic books are absolute dog shit. The most expensive comic books in all of North America are IDW. Get that through your fucking mind. The worst books out there with the worst editing, the worst art, for the most part out there, are IDW. Among these 6, abso-fucking-lutely. It's not even close. Most expensive. And that's what you're paying for. And that's why IDW is going to go down in a blaze of glory. It's been a long, slow process, but believe me, we're very close to the end. Now, as far as the other publishers, we've identified the cheapest publisher, Image Comics. We've identified the most expensive publisher, IDW on average. What are Marvel's numbers? The average Marvel comic book in November, and they're producing 70 of them, is $4.70. If you're a Marvel completionist, you're going to have to shell out $330 total just for the A covers. As far as number 1 issues, it's a down month. They only have 7. Normally it represents about 20%. This month it's actually going to be 10% November. The average price jumps all the way up to $5.29 on average per issue for number 1s, because they've got to bend you over, forget the lube, and take it out of your ass. DC Comics, they're producing 56 comic books in total. Remember, Image does 55, DC's doing 56. $4.77 on average, even more expensive than Marvel. The average number 1 issue is actually $4.75, which is a bit of an anomaly. DC number 1 issues are normally way more expensive, but they're doing like a few special issues, I guess that. But still far more expensive than even Image Comics are doing. But that number is normally close to $5.25. Certainly more expensive than Image. Dark Horse, they're putting out 31 comic books, $4.68 on average. Cheaper than both Marvel and DC. Dark Horse, the licensing company, the company that's got Miller World and all that stuff, you would expect them to be far more expensive, you know, with the Jeff Lemire, you know, Black Hammer universe and your Mike Mignola fucking Hellboy and all that kind of stuff. Somehow produce cheaper comic books, although their number 1 issues on average are $5.40 in November. And finally, Boom Studios is much closer to IDW than it is to Image. They're producing 19 new books for $5.18 on average, and then $6 on average for number 1 issues. And they don't only have 1 new book for $6. They have 4 new books for an average of $6 an issue. So Boom is right up there with IDW, is contending for the most expensive publisher out there. Are Boom worth that right now? What's Boom actually doing right now that's even good? Is it still Something Is Killing the Children? I went back 2 months ago and it seemed like it sucked to me. Boom kind of boomed, no pun intended, I guess. About 3 years ago during COVID, they had a bunch of hot titles and now they have nothing left. They've got no hot titles really out there. So that's what they're doing with the publishers. Things are way out of hand. We're creeping closer and closer to $5 on average per issue. The only one that isn't even close to it is Image, and I find that shocking. They should be the most expensive publisher out there because they're the indie publisher that has the best talent, but somehow they come in underneath everybody else. A lot of that is on Todd McFarland and the Spawn universe, but there are other comics and creators out there doing the $2.99 price point, so obviously it's doable. But Boom and IDW and the other publishers have taken a different track, and I will be very shocked by the end of 2025 if all the publishers other than Image aren't over $5 an issue on average across the board. Definitely want to hear your feedback regarding how expensive comic books are in this conversation. Really appreciate that. If you would like to support me and what I'm doing here on Think Critical YouTube and allow me to read comic books for a living and talk about them, I really do appreciate it. Visit me on Think Critical Patreon. You support us there, you throw a little money our way, and then we give you awesome extra content in the form of podcasts, extra videos, polls, all that kind of stuff. Hope to see you there very soon.